60 acres of dead sunflowers sound like paper tearing in the wind. When the co-op man drove off in his spotless truck, he left Nora with a piece of paper declaring her life's work worthless. He saw shattered seeds. Nora looked at her grease-stained fingers and saw liquid gold. The stalks were bent at sharp, agonizing angles, snapped halfway up by a freak August hailstorm that had rolled over the ridge like a freight train. 60 acres of premium confectionery sunflowers. Yesterday, they had stood 6 feet tall, their heavy yellow heads tracking the late summer sun. Today, they looked like a battlefield. Dean didn't even bother putting on his field boots. He stood on the edge of the gravel driveway in his clean khakis and pressed white shirt, looking out over the brown, bruised expanse of Nora's south field. He held an iPad encased in a heavy-duty rubber shell. He tapped the screen twice. He didn't look at her. "It's a total loss, Nora," Dean said. His voice had that practiced, flat cadence of a man who delivered bad news for a living and had learned not to absorb any of it. Nora stood next to him in a canvas jacket, patched at the elbows, her boots sinking slightly into the rain-softened dirt. She held one of the severed sunflower heads in her hands. It was heavy. The hail had pitted the back of the green receptacle, turning it a sickly, bruised brown. But the seeds were still there. "The seeds are intact, Dean," she said. Her voice was quiet. She hated how quiet it was. "The shells took a beating, yeah, but the meats are fine. Cut them open yourself." She tossed the heavy head toward him. He didn't try to catch it. It hit the dirt by his pristine leather shoes with a dull thud. "It doesn't matter what the inside looks like, and you know it," Dean sighed, finally looking up from his screen. "You signed a contract for grade 1 snacking seed. We bag these for grocery stores. They have to look perfect. No pitting, no mold risk, intact striping. These are bruised. The moisture content spiked from the storm, and my agronomist says rot will set in before you can even get them in the bin. The co-op is exercising the Act of God clause. We're voiding the contract." "Take them for bird seed," Nora countered, stepping forward. "Grade 3, I'll take the penalty." "Elevator's full," Dean said, shifting his weight. "We hit our quota for salvage grade 3 weeks ago when the drought broke up north. I'm sorry, Nora, I really am. But I can't take this crop, not even for pennies. You need to call your crop insurance adjuster and take the payout. Insurance covers 50% of the projected yield," Nora said, her jaw tightening. "The bank expects 100% of my mortgage payment by November 1st. Dean offered a tight, sympathetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe it's time to talk to a realtor. This land is getting tough to hold on to for a solo operator anyway. I can give you a name. Get off my property, Dean." He didn't argue. He climbed back into his idling air-conditioned truck, put it in drive, and rolled slowly down the driveway, the tires crunching loudly over the gravel. Nora stood alone in the quiet. The wind picked up, rattling the broken stalks. The sound was dry and hollow. $200,000 in operating loans. The diesel, the fertilizer, the seed, the long nights in the tractor cab staring at the GPS monitor. All of it erased in 20 minutes of ice falling from the sky. Her father had lost 30 acres to blight a decade ago and drank himself to an early grave over it. Nora had buried him, assumed the farm's debt, and spent the last 5 years clawing her way back to zero. This crop was supposed to be the one that put her in the black. She walked into the field. The mud sucked at her boots. She smelled the sharp, bitter scent of crushed vegetation. She stopped by a massive stalk, snapped halfway down, its flower face planted in the dirt. Nora crouched. She picked up the head. She brushed the mud off the seeds. They were black and white, striped, plump, and tightly packed in their spiral pattern. She dug her thumb in and pried a dozen seeds loose. Dean was right about one thing. They were ugly. The hail had nicked the shells. But Nora didn't care about the shells. She put a seed between her teeth and cracked it. She spat the hull into the dirt and chewed the kernel. It was rich, nutty, and heavy. She looked at her hand. She pressed her thumb hard against a handful of the kernels, crushing them against her palm. When she pulled her thumb away, her skin gleamed. Oil. The co-op wanted pretty shells for people to spit into baseball dugouts. They didn't care about the fat inside, but the fat was there. Nora wiped her oily palm on her denim thigh. She looked out at the 60 acres, millions of broken heads, tons of seeds. If they won't buy the seeds, she thought, I'll sell what's inside them. The industrial salvage yard sat 3 counties over, a sprawling graveyard of rusted corrugated steel and forgotten agricultural dreams. Nora drove her dented Ford F-250 through the gates just as the morning fog began to burn off. She had spent 3 nights glued to a glowing laptop screen in her dark kitchen, surviving on black coffee and stale toast. She had gone down a rabbit hole of commodities markets, processing yields and heavy machinery. Commercial sunflower oil was pressed in massive, multi-million-dollar solvent extraction plants. She couldn't do that. But cold-pressed, unrefined oil, the kind sold in glass bottles at premium prices, just required brute force, friction and pressure. She found the listing on an obscure auction board. Lot 42, Expeller Press, condition unknown. The yard manager, a heavy-set man named Frank with a permanent grease smudge on his forehead, led her past rows of cannibalized tractors and dead combines. "Here she is," Frank said, kicking the base of a massive cast-iron machine sitting on a rotting wooden pallet. Old Screw Press came out of a defunct commercial bakery up near Billings. They used it to press flax and canola back in the 90s. Been sitting in the rain since. It was hideous. It stood 5 feet tall, weighing easily 1.5 tons. The hopper was dented, the belts were dry-rotted, and the main expeller cage was crusted with decades-old petrified plant matter. It looked less like a piece of processing equipment and more like a torture device. "Does the motor turn?" Nora asked, shining a flashlight into the dark, rusted cavity of the screw shaft. "Don't know. 3-phase motor on it. We don't have the hookups to test it." "Selling it as scrap weight, mostly," Frank said, wiping his hands on a rag. "You don't want this, lady. It's a boat anchor." "I have $1,200 left on my credit card," Nora said, not looking up from the machine. "Load it in my truck." Getting it home was terrifying. The Ford's rear suspension bottomed out, the bumper hovering inches from the highway for 80 miles. When she finally backed into her main equipment shed, she had to chain the press to the bucket of her front-end loader just to drag it off the truck bed. It hit the concrete floor of the shed with a metallic boom that echoed in the rafters. For the next 10 days, Nora didn't sleep. She became a creature of grease and WD-40. She stripped the press down to its bare bones. Every bolt was seized. She had to take a blowtorch to the rusty nuts, heating the metal until it glowed dull red, then hammering them loose with a heavy breaker bar. She shredded the knuckles on her right hand when a wrench slipped, leaving streaks of blood on the cast iron. She didn't stop. Her neighbor, Dave, pulled up one afternoon while she was rewiring the electrical box to run off her shed's 220-volt line. Dave farmed 1,000 acres of corn and soybeans up the road. He was a good man, but deeply conventional. He played the commodity game exactly the way the co-op told him to. He leaned against the shed door frame, holding a thermal mug of coffee, watching her splice thick copper wire. "Heard you were skipping the insurance adjuster, Nora," Dave said. His voice was careful, laced with the kind of pity Nora despised. "Rumor at the diner is you're not tearing up the South Field. You're letting it dry. It's drying down fine, Nora said, wrapping electrical tape around a joint. Stalks are dead, but the heads are curing. Dave stepped into the shed. He looked at the gutted, imposing mass of the oil press. What the hell is that? Expeller press. You're pressing salvage? Dave let out a low whistle. Nora, come on. The market for crude oil is pennies on the pound. The freight alone to ship bulk crude to a refinery will eat you alive. Take the insurance check. Rest the field. Try again next spring. Don't throw good money after bad. Nora dropped her wire strippers on the concrete. She stood up, wiping the sweat off her forehead with the back of a dirty wrist. Insurance covers half, Dave. The bank wants it all. If I take the check, I lose the farm by Christmas. I have 60 acres of seed out there. The shell is garbage, but the meat is 25% oil by weight. I'm not selling bulk crude to a refinery. I'm going to press it cold, filter it, and sell it straight to the bottling brokers. Dave stared at her. You're out of your mind. That machine looks like it hasn't run since the Carter administration. It'll jam on the first hopper. Then I'll unjam it, Nora said flatly. Dave shook his head, took a sip of his coffee, and walked back to his truck. Let me know if you need help towing that thing to the dump, he called out, before driving off. 2 days later, Nora finished putting the cage back together. She had replaced the drive belts, repacked the bearings with fresh grease, and scrubbed the steel screw until her shoulders screamed. It was time for the test. She had gone out that morning with a pair of loppers and hand-harvested 2 buckets of the dried, hail-damaged sunflower heads. She spent an hour manually beating the heads against the side of a feed trough to knock the seeds loose. She ran them through a makeshift screen to get the biggest chunks of stalk and debris out. She stood before the press. The shed was quiet. She threw the heavy electrical breaker on the wall. The machine groaned. It was a deep, guttural sound, like a sleeping beast being kicked awake. The 3-phase motor hummed loudly, drawing so much power the overhead lights in the shed dimmed to an amber glow. Slowly, agonizingly, the massive steel screw inside the cage began to turn. It didn't explode. Nora picked up the plastic bucket of seeds. Her heart hammered against her ribs, keeping time with the heavy thump, thump, thump of the machine's drive belt. She climbed a stepladder and dumped the seed into the top hopper. For a terrifying minute, nothing happened. The seeds just sat there. Then, the auger grabbed them. The machine's pitch changed entirely. The hum turned into a violent, deafening screech of metal grinding against organic matter. The press vibrated so hard the concrete floor shook beneath Nora's boots. She gripped the edge of the hopper, knuckles white, praying the rusted cast iron wouldn't shatter under the immense pressure. Friction heat began to radiate from the barrel. A sharp, toasted, nutty smell filled the shed. Nora climbed down and fell to her knees beside the oil chute. At first it was just a trickle of dark, sludgy sediment. Nora's stomach dropped. But then the screw caught the main mass of the seed. The pressure spiked. From the narrow slits of the steel cage, liquid began to weep. It beaded up, joined together, and flowed down the metal runoff plate. It wasn't clear. It was cloudy, thick, and dark amber, full of fine particulate. But it was oil. It dripped steadily into the collection pan beneath the chute. Plop, plop, plop. Nora reached out with a trembling finger and caught a drop before it hit the pan. The oil was hot from the friction. She rubbed it between her thumb and forefinger. It was incredibly slick, heavy, and smelled like roasted earth and deep summer. She sat back on her heels on the dirty concrete, staring at the growing pool of liquid gold in the pan. The machine roared behind her, a beautiful, deafening roar. The co-op had written off her 60 acres as trash, but as Nora watched the oil flow, she did the math in her head. She didn't need their premium seed prices anymore. She had just become her own factory. Harvesting a dead crop is a battle of attrition. Usually, a combine glide through a field of standing sunflowers like a ship parting water, snapping the heavy heads off clean. But Nora's stalks were snapped, tangled, and laying low to the ground. She spent 3 days in the cab of her John Deere, running the header inches from the dirt, scooping up mud, rocks, and shattered stalks along with the seed. The dust was thick and black, choking the machine's air filters every few hours. She had to climb down in the sweltering, late September heat, her face caked in a mask of dirt and sweat, to beat the filters against the massive rubber tires until she could breathe again. The seed that poured into the grain cart was ugly. It was full of debris, broken hulls, and pulverized leaves. A co-op inspector would have taken one look at it and laughed. Nora just watched the pile grow, her eyes tracking the volume. Trash didn't matter anymore. The expeller press didn't care about aesthetics. It only cared about density. By the first week of October, the field was stripped bare, and the equipment shed was transformed into a crude, deafening factory. She had bought a dozen 275-gallon IBC totes, massive square plastic tanks encased in aluminum cages, second-hand from a defunct liquid fertilizer distributor. She lined them up along the back wall of the shed. The process was brutally physical. Nora loaded the seed into a hopper she'd rigged from scrap sheet metal, which fed a small grain auger that carried the crop up to the hungry mouth of the press. The noise was constant. The shed vibrated 24 hours a day. Nora slept in short, fitful bursts on a canvas cot shoved into the corner, waking every time the pitch of the motor changed. If the auger jammed, the pitch went high and whiny. If a rock made it into the cage, it sounded like a shotgun going off, and she had to scramble to hit the emergency kill switch before the gears stripped. Her life shrank to a repetitive, exhausting loop. Wake up. Shovel seed. Check the oil flow. Clean the screens. Sleep for 40 minutes. Repeat. The crude oil pouring out of the press was thick with plant wax and sediment. It looked like muddy river water. To fix that, Nora had jury-rigged a filtration system using a heavy-duty pump and a bank of stainless steel mesh filters she'd scavenged from a bankrupt microbrewery. The first time she switched the pump on, she held her breath. The murky oil pushed through the high-pressure hoses, forced its way through the micron screens, and spilled into the first clean IBC tote. It was perfect. The sediment was stripped away, leaving behind a liquid so clear and deeply golden it seemed to catch and hold the harsh fluorescent light of the shed. It smelled incredible. A rich, toasty aroma of roasted seeds and warm earth. It was heavy, slick, and completely unrefined. Her clothes were permanently ruined, saturated with oil that no amount of heavy-duty detergent could cut. Her hands were blistered from the shovel handle and slick with grease. She was surviving on cold canned soup and black coffee. By the 3rd week of October, the bank started calling. The automated voicemails from the loan department were polite but firm. This is a courtesy reminder regarding your operating loan balance, due in full on November 1st. She deleted them. She didn't have time to talk to a banker. She was down to the last 1,000 bushels of seed. One evening, Dave pulled his truck up to the shed. He stood in the doorway, staring at the industrial setup. The hum of the press was deafening. He looked at the row of IBC totes, 10 of them filled to the brim with glowing amber oil, stacked too high against the corrugated steel wall. Nora hit the master kill switch. The silence that followed was heavy and ringing. She wiped her forehead with a shop rag and looked at him. "I thought you were crazy," Dave said, his voice quiet in the sudden quiet. He walked over to a tote and tapped the thick plastic. "I really did. How much is here?" "About 2,800 gallons, Nora said, her voice raspy from the dust. "High oleic, Cold pressed. Should finish the last of the seed by Tuesday. It'll top out over 3,000. Who's buying it? I don't know yet, Nora admitted, tossing the dirty rag onto a workbench. I sent out 16 sample jars in the mail last week. Overnight shipping. Hit every artisanal food broker and organic snack manufacturer from Chicago to Seattle. Someone is going to want it. Dave looked at her, concern pulling at the corners of his eyes. Nora, it's the 20th. The note is due in 11 days. Even if you find a buyer, setting up freight, negotiating a contract, waiting for accounts payable, it takes 30 to 60 days to see a check. You're out of time. Call the bank. Beg for an extension. They don't do extensions on zero balance accounts, Dave. It's cash or the deed. She turned her back on him and threw the main breaker. The massive motor roared back to life, drowning out whatever he was going to say next. She picked up a shovel. She had to keep the hopper full. The buyer's name was Reed. He drove a rented luxury SUV that looked absurdly out of place, parked on the rutted gravel next to Nora's rusted F-250. He had called her 2 days after receiving the mason jar. He was a purchasing agent for a mid-sized, aggressively expanding natural foods brand based out of Boulder. They manufactured organic kettle chips and premium roasted nuts, built entirely around the marketing gimmick of single-origin, unprocessed ingredients. Reed stepped into the shed, wearing raw denim jeans and a Patagonia vest, looking like a man who had never held a shovel in his life. He stopped and stared at the towering row of filled oil totes, then at the massive grease-stained expeller press in the center of the room. Finally, he looked at Nora. She was covered in dirt, her hands calloused and black under the fingernails. "You pressed all of this yourself?" Reed asked, shouting slightly over the hum of the cooling fan. "Every drop," Nora said. She walked over to the nearest tote, opened the bottom valve, and let a few ounces of the golden oil flow into a clean glass beaker. She handed it to him. Reed held it up to the light. He swirled it. He dipped a clean pinky finger into the oil and tasted it. His eyes changed. The corporate, practiced neutrality slipped for just a fraction of a second, replaced by genuine surprise. "The lab tests on your sample came back yesterday," Reed said, wiping his finger on a linen handkerchief. "The oleic acid profile is incredibly high. The smoke point is perfect. And the flavor, it's exactly what our R&D team wants for the new heritage chip line. But we usually buy from commercial crushers. We need a reliable supply chain. I'm looking at a shed in the middle of nowhere. You're looking at 3,000 gallons of pure, unfiltered, cold-pressed oil ready to load onto a flatbed today," Nora corrected him, crossing her arms. "No waiting on commercial crushers to fit you into their schedule. No blending with inferior grades. Single origin. From that dirt right outside this door, through that press, into this tank. Your marketing department can write a whole novel on the back of the chip bag about it." Reed smiled a thin, calculating smile. "It's a good story, I'll give you that. But it's still crude oil. The commodity market for bulk crude sunflower oil is sitting at 40 cents a pound. I'll offer you 80. Double the market rate, considering the cold-pressed quality." Nora didn't blink. She had spent the last 2 hours on her laptop, memorizing the retail and wholesale pricing of premium culinary oils. Cold-pressed, high oleic sunflower oil retails in specialty stores for $30 a gallon, Nora said, her voice completely flat. "You don't want this for a fryer vat. You want this for the label. $3 a pound. That's $22 a gallon. Take it or leave it." Reed let out a sharp laugh. $3? You're out of your mind. I can import organic oil from Europe for less than that." "Then do it," Nora said. She turned around and walked toward the workbench, picking up a wrench. But your freight ships are backed up at the port of Los Angeles for 6 weeks, and I know your Q4 product launch is in 30 days. You don't have 6 weeks. You have right now." Reed stopped laughing. He looked at the oil, then at Nora's back. He knew she had him cornered. The supply chain bottlenecks had been a nightmare for his company all year. Having product sitting in the Midwest, ready to truck out tomorrow, was a logistical miracle. 250, Reed countered, and I need the trucks loaded by Thursday. 275, Nora shot back, turning to face him. And you wire the money to my bank account the second the bill of lading is signed by the driver. No 30-day net terms. I need the cash cleared by Monday. Reed stared at her. He was calculating the margins, doing the invisible math in his head. Finally, he nodded. 275. Wired upon loading. You've got a deal. When the flatbed trucks rolled out of Nora's driveway 3 days later, carrying the 12 massive plastic totes strapped down tight under heavy canvas tarps, the shed felt incredibly empty. Nora sat in the cab of her pickup, the engine idling. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder. She picked it up. It was a notification from her bank app. Incoming wire transfer. 61.600 Phantos Wars. Gut. 60 acres of Grade 1 confectionery seed would have grossed her $45,000, and the co-op would have taken their sweet time mailing the check. The oil just cleared 61,000. She put the truck in gear and drove the 8 miles into town. The bank was quiet, smelling of floor wax and stale coffee. She walked straight to the loan officer's desk. He looked up, surprised, adjusting his tie. "Nora, I was going to call you. The deadline—" "I know," Nora said. She pulled her phone out, opened the app and slid it across his desk. "Transfer the balance of the operating loan from my checking account to the debt ledger. Pay it off. Every cent." The loan officer looked at the screen. He blinked twice. Did the insurance payout come through high?" "I didn't take the insurance," Nora said, taking her phone back. "I pressed it." She didn't wait for him to understand. She turned and walked out the glass doors into the crisp, biting air of late October. When she got back to the farm, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, bruised, purple shadows across the empty south field. The crushed, broken stalks were rotting into the dirt, feeding the soil for the next rotation. Nora walked into the equipment shed. The expeller press sat in the center, silent, cold, and coated in a thick layer of grease and dust. It was an ugly, heavy, brutal piece of machinery. She walked over to it and rested her hand on the cold iron hopper. Her knuckles were scarred, her back ached with a deep, permanent exhaustion, and her bank account was nearly empty again after paying off the debt. But the land was hers. The co-op didn't own her. The debt didn't own her. Nora looked out the open shed doors toward the empty field, already calculating the fertilizer mix for the spring planting. She patted the iron flank of the press. "Rest up," she whispered into the quiet shed. "We do it again in September. Farming isn't just about putting seeds in the dirt. It's about having the grit to survive when the sky falls on your livelihood." Nora didn't ask for permission to save her farm. She just built a different door. If this story of brutal resilience and outsmarting the system hit home for you, hit that like button, share it with someone who respects the hustle, and subscribe for more stories of people who refuse to be written off.